All right. In this section, we're going to start looking at discrimination as an explanation of the wage gap. The way we do things is going to be quite different than the textbook, especially in the order and also a little bit in the substance. So what I like to do is I like to start with the theories of discrimination that economists have, and then I like to go to the evidence, whereas the textbook kind of goes the opposite direction. So anyways, we're going to start with the theories. The second thing is the textbook explains the theories strictly about gender, at least for the most part, and I'm going to explain them the way they were originally written, which is focused more at race, and then later on they were used to apply to gender as well. So anyways, you might see some differences, but it's basically the same thing. All right. So this week we're gonna start talking about discrimination, like I said. And so this week our plan is to talk about what is discrimination, talk about the main theories. There's two main theories in economics: the taste for discrimination and statistical discrimination. And then we'll start looking at evidence. And so as much as we have time for, we'll look at evidence, things like advertisements, field experiments. I might refer to a couple of court cases. And then next week, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about indirect evidence. So one is this idea of regression results. We're going to see how the wage gap has evolved and kind of look through some of the explanations of why it has changed over time and what degree this unexplained part is not changed or has changed. And then finally, we're going to come briefly touch on policies that are directed on discrimination and the wage gap. Okay. All right. So here we're going to define labor market discrimination as seen by economists. And this definition is fairly strict in the sense that whenever we see a difference between two people, we don't tend to assume that it's discrimination. We look through lots of other things. But so here's the definition that we're going to be working with. So for economics, we generally say labor market discrimination is if two equally qualified people, equal productivity, and equal taste for work conditions are treated differently, whether for hiring, pay, promotion, etc. And the reason they're treated differently is because of gender or race or age or religion or sexual orientation, for example. Then we consider that to be labor market discrimination. So some of these are hard to measure, and we'll see next week. Things like productivity is actually a little bit hard to measure. We can measure the variables that are associated with productivity, like education level, and sometimes if we have the data, we can use major, for example. But it's fair, there's other parts of productivity that are hard to measure that we don't necessarily have any data on, or we couldn't even necessarily know them even if we had data. Also, taste for work is another important one. So taste for work has to do with things like what kind of work do you want to do? Are you willing to do dangerous work? Are you willing to do work that maybe is the conditions of the work are not very good, like out in bad weather, or maybe you have to work at night, or you have to be on call during certain hours, or do you want a regular, predictable schedule? How willing are people to work overtime, etc. So these are all taste for work conditions. So if two people are the same on these things, and then they are treated differently by race or gender or something else, then we consider this to be labor market discrimination. And so that's why next week we're going to see a big discussion into the details of these things, especially the details of taste for work when we look at this family gap. So we'll come back to that later. For economists, discrimination and prejudice are not the same thing. And I guess for everybody, they're not the same thing. So prejudice would, in the way I'm using prejudice here, would be like somebody has sort of negative viewpoint towards a group of people. All right, they have some kind of negative viewpoint about them. The difference for us in this thing is that discrimination requires action. Okay, so in order to there to be discrimination, there needs to be action. If there's no action, then there's no discrimination. So I mean, if they need something has to happen, right? Or I guess it could also not happen, but there has to be something that's done, or a rule in place in a company that separates two people and doesn't treat them equally, right? Or something is done in terms of hiring, pay, promotion, etc. These are all discrimination. If somebody has negative thoughts in their head, but they never release them and they never act on them, we won't have a way to measure it in this case. So we're focusing very much on discrimination involving actions here. Okay, so usually economics looks at discrimination in the labor market in three kind of areas. So we look at hiring, so things like barriers to entry, is it difficult to get hired? And some of the direct evidence we're going to look at this week is about this hiring decision. And we will find that there is discrimination in hiring, um, and there's quite a bit of we'll find some pretty good evidence for racial discrimination in hiring. The second one is pay. Well, so if is there an unexplained wage gap? So that means that a wage gap that can't be explained by people's productive characteristics, like their education and their years of experience and these kind of things. And we'll come back to that next week when we look at the econometrics. And then things like promotion. Is there a glass ceiling? And this can be related to the pay gap as well. But we'll look at that a little bit next week as well. So these are the areas that we mostly look at. Economists also look at discrimination in other markets. For example, there's quite a lot of literature. If you're interested in the consumer market, there's some interesting ones about discrimination in buying cars, for example. They find some experimental studies have found that there's quite a bit of discrimination in things like buying cars. Also, education and access to education and school segregation is quite a big literature in economics. And finally, also lending is a big literature in economics, lending and real estate, about especially racial discrimination in lending markets. So anyways, these are all areas. In fact, if you want to, you could pursue some of these areas for your final project. Now, economists tend to focus on markets because that's what we know how to do. By But by focusing just on markets, we also tend to miss some things. Okay, so some things we miss. If there's things that are happening outside a market, like that aren't occurring through a market, but are occurring like subtle discrimination in society in general or through the media and such that economists might miss by focusing on this. Those might be shaping people's preferences and people's choices in ways that have already happened before the people come to the market, right? So the market might just be part of the story, and there might be all these other things that are happening before people even get to the market. So even before people get to school, they already have formed ideas, or before the consumer even arrives to buy the things, they already have been influenced by these things. Okay, and same thing for the labor market. So we're not saying that we're capturing all of what's going on, but we are capturing part of what's going on in a way that I think is pretty convincing. Okay, so let's keep going.